For years, Vladimir Putin was able to sell the illusion of strength. Even as Russia became more isolated, even as sanctions tightened, even as the invasion of Ukraine exposed the weakness of the Russian army, the Kremlin still had one powerful argument for survival: oil. Oil kept the state alive. Oil kept money flowing into Moscow. Oil helped pay soldiers, fuel military vehicles, sustain industry, and bankroll the missiles and drones that Russia kept hurling at Ukrainian cities. It was the one lifeline Putin could always count on, the one pillar strong enough to hold up a failing war machine. Now that pillar is cracking. Ukraine has launched a relentless, highly organized, and increasingly devastating campaign against Russia's oil infrastructure, and the damage is no longer isolated or symbolic. It is systemic. It is growing. And it may be pushing Russia toward the most severe oil supply disruption in its modern history. Putin was warned this was coming. Ukraine did not hide its intentions. From the early stages of the war, Ukrainian forces made it clear that they would go after the infrastructure feeding Russia's war effort. That meant refineries. That meant storage depots. That meant production facilities, pipelines, export terminals, ports, and the tankers moving Russian oil through shadow networks designed to dodge sanctions. In the beginning, these attacks were limited by circumstance. Ukraine had to prioritize survival, defend its own territory, and absorb wave after wave of Russian assaults. It did not yet have the full range of tools, long-range drones, or strike capacity needed to wage a sustained campaign deep inside Russia. But that changed. By 2025, the pace and sophistication of Ukrainian attacks had surged. And by 2026, the campaign had become something far more dangerous for Moscow: a coordinated effort to cripple the very industry that keeps Putin's regime breathing. The consequences are now impossible to ignore. According to major reporting cited by outlets such as Reuters, Russia's oil export capacity has fallen by roughly 40%. That translates to around 2 million barrels per day. 2 million barrels that Russia once sold across the world every single day. 2 million barrels that once generated enormous revenue for the Kremlin. 2 million barrels that helped finance salaries, military procurement, battlefield logistics, drone production, missile programs, and the entire machinery of the Russian war effort. Losing that kind of volume is not a small disruption. It is a strategic wound. And what makes it even worse for Moscow is that this was not caused by one spectacular strike or one catastrophic accident. It was the result of a deliberate, patient, highly targeted campaign carried out over months, one precision attack after another, each one cutting a little deeper into the artery that keeps the Russian state functioning. That campaign reached a new level in March 2026, when Ukraine launched a string of major strikes against some of the most important sites in Russia's energy network. At the start of the month, on March 2nd, Ukrainian drones struck the Novorossiysk oil terminal in Krasnodar Krai on the Black Sea. This was not a random target. Novorossiysk is one of the key locations in Russia's oil export system, and the Sheskry's oil facility in particular plays a major role in receiving, storing, and loading millions of barrels onto tankers. Many of those tankers are believed to be linked to Russia's notorious shadow fleet, the web of vessels used to bypass sanctions and keep oil money flowing despite international restrictions. When local eyewitnesses reported that Ukrainian drones had ignited the terminal overnight, it became immediately clear that Kiev was once again hitting the Kremlin where it hurts most. The local mayor, Andrei Kravchenko, confirmed the attack, while residents posted images and footage showing the site on fire. What made the strike even more significant was the fact that this was not the first time the facility had been hit. In November 2025, oil loadings at Novorossiysk were already suspended temporarily following another Ukrainian strike. Later that same month, the Sheskry site was hit again. In other words, Ukraine was not simply proving it could reach Novorossiysk. It was proving it could keep coming back. Since the most recent attack, the terminal, which normally handles up to 700,000 barrels of oil per day, has reportedly been operating well below peak capacity. That matters enormously. When a hub that important slows down, the effects ripple outward through export schedules, tanker traffic, logistics chains, and the broader balance sheet of the Russian state. Then came Labitsk. On March 16th, reports emerged of another successful Ukrainian drone strike, again in Krasnodar Krai, this time in the town of Labinsk near the Bolshaya-Laba River, more than 500 kilometers from the front line. That detail alone says a lot about how far Ukraine's strike capabilities have evolved. This was not some frontline fuel dump sitting close to active combat. This was a deep rear area target, a node connecting Russia's fuel production system to military operations in southern Ukraine. Around 2 a.m., Ukrainian drone crews reportedly sent their aircraft into the area, triggering explosions near the town's oil depot. Almost immediately, local telegram channels began reporting the blasts. Images and videos followed, showing flames reaching into the night sky and smoke pouring over fuel storage tanks. The fire continued into the morning. With every minute that passed, more Russian fuel was lost, and more pressure was added to a system already under strain. For firefighting crews, and additional rescue teams were reportedly needed to bring the blaze under control. But by the time they did, the real damage had already been done. Another critical oil site had been hit. Another rear area location that should have felt comparatively safe had proven vulnerable. Another piece of the machinery feeding Russian military operations had been thrown into disruption. Just 5 days later, on March 21st, Ukraine struck again, this time against one of the oldest and most important refineries still operating in Russia, the Saratov oil refinery. Located in southwestern Russia and owned by Rosneft, Saratov is no minor facility. It processes around 4.8 million tons of oil and produces more than 20 types of fuel and chemical products, including diesel, gasoline, fuel oil, vacuum gas oil, and technical sulfur. These are not abstract industrial outputs. They are materials with direct significance for both Russia's economy and its military capabilities. Ukraine had identified Saratov as a priority target long ago and had already hit it numerous times since the war began. But the March 21st strike was one of the most damaging yet. According to reporting tied to Russian emergency sources, the attack damaged a secondary processing unit and a large vertical storage tank. A diesel tank with a capacity of 10,000 tons was set on fire, and the blaze reportedly spread across an area of roughly 400 square meters. Drone debris also fell onto a nearby thermal power plant, causing additional damage. This was not random luck. This was the result of planning, coordination, and execution by some of Ukraine's most capable drone warfare formations, including the 1st Separate Center, the 414th Magyar's Birds Brigade, and the 413th Raid Regiment, working with other Ukrainian defense units. Rosneft has spent months trying to protect facilities like Saratov, throwing more defenses around them, tightening security, and seeking new ways to shield critical infrastructure. None of it has proven enough. Ukraine's drones keep getting through. And if Russia thought it had reached the limit of what Ukraine could do in 1 month, the final weeks of March proved otherwise. By then, Moscow was already under pressure on multiple fronts. Its army was still failing to produce meaningful breakthroughs on the battlefield, one assault after another collapsing under Ukrainian defenses. Meanwhile, the oil infrastructure meant to keep the state financially stable had already taken a series of painful blows. Then came Primorsk. Located in Russia's Leningrad region near the border with Finland, Primorsk is the second largest Baltic port in Russia after St. Petersburg. It is one of the country's most important export gateways and the endpoint of the Baltic pipeline system. It is also another major hub for the movement of Russian crude through the Shadow Fleet. Tankers move in and out of Primorsk constantly, carrying Urals crude beyond the reach of official channels and helping generate the kind of revenue Moscow desperately needs. That makes Primorsk a prime target, and Ukraine treated it as such. On the night of March 23rd, Ukraine launched a large-scale drone strike against the port. The raid was part of a broader wave of attacks that reportedly saw Russian officials claim nearly 250 drones had been downed over several regions, including Leningrad, Kursk, Moscow, and Belgorod. But despite those defenses, some of the drones reached Primorsk. A large fire broke out at the export hub. Personnel were evacuated. Operations halted. Damage was reported to the tank park and oil handling infrastructure. Governor Alexander Drozdenko confirmed that a fuel storage tank had been struck, triggering the blaze. Images on social media showed thick black smoke billowing above the facility for days. Satellite images later indicated that at least 4 separate tanks had caught fire. Even after the terminal resumed some activity, it did so at severely reduced capacity. For a site that handles such enormous throughput, even temporary degradation translates into serious financial pain. 2 days later, Ukraine struck U.S. Teluga. That attack on March 25th sent another major Russian oil and gas port into crisis. U.S. Teluga lies roughly 1,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border in northwestern Russia. On paper, it should have been well outside the normal danger zone. In reality, Ukraine's long-range drones reached it anyway. Residents reportedly counted at least 10 explosions. A huge fire lit up the night sky. By dawn, smoke was towering over the area. Governor Drozdenko once again had to acknowledge the incident, even as officials tried to minimize its importance. But U.S. Teluga is simply too important to hide. This port is capable of handling around 700,000 barrels of oil per day. It is also a major natural gas and LNG processing center, reportedly processing up to 45 billion cubic meters of gas annually and producing around 13 million tons of liquefied natural gas, in addition to millions of tons of ethane and liquefied petroleum gas. It also handles coal, grain, and fertilizer exports. Ukraine had already targeted U.S. Teluga before, including a major security service strike in January 2024 and another attack in August 2025. The March 2026 strike was therefore part of a pattern, not an isolated event. Once again, Ukraine showed that it could return to the same vital target again and again until the cumulative damage became impossible to absorb. Reports indicated that the entire terminal had to be sealed off and shut down while firefighters worked to control the blaze. Restarting operations at anything close to normal capacity was expected to take time. And still the campaign continued. Overnight on March 26th, Ukraine launched yet another large-scale drone attack in the Leningrad region, this time focusing on one of Russia's biggest oil refineries, the Kurishi Petroleum Organic Synthesis Plant, better known as Kinov. Located near St. Petersburg, Kinov is one of the giants of Russia's refining sector, with annual processing capacity reaching around 20 million tons. That makes it the second largest refinery in the country by throughput. It produces enormous volumes of fuel and petrochemicals used both inside Russia and exported abroad. In short, it is another strategic site with huge value to the Kremlin. Reports indicated that more than 20 Ukrainian drones struck critical infrastructure in and around the area. As usual, Governor Drozdenko tried to soften the blow, stressing that air defenses had intercepted many of the drones and claiming there had been no casualties. But he still admitted that an industrial zone had been damaged. At the same time, Russia's defense ministry said it had downed around 125 Ukrainian fixed-wing drones that night, while authorities suspended operations at major airports including Sheremetyevo in Moscow and Pulkovo in St. Petersburg. That tells its own story. Even when Russia claims tactical success in intercepting large numbers of drones, the operational impact of these raids is still severe. Air traffic is disrupted. Emergency services are stretched. Energy infrastructure is damaged. And the message to investors, insurers, and logistics planners is unmistakable. Nowhere is reliably safe. This is what makes Ukraine's current strategy so powerful. In the early months of the war, it did not have the luxury of waging this kind of campaign. It had to survive. It had to stop Russian advances. It lacked the numbers, the long-range systems, and the mature domestic defense industry needed for repeated deep strikes. Today, the picture is completely different. Ukraine has spent years building one of the most dynamic wartime defense sectors in the world. Hundreds of companies have emerged, working on missiles, drones, electronic warfare, targeting systems, and strike coordination. At the same time, Ukrainian forces have grown far more effective at blunting Russian offensives at the front, using tactics designed not merely to hold ground, but to bleed the attacker, lure Russian units into kill zones, and destroy them with layered artillery and drone fire. That battlefield adaptation has created breathing space, and Ukraine is now using that space to hit back deeper and harder than ever before. Pipelines, refineries, oil terminals, export ports, tankers, and related facilities are no longer occasional targets of opportunity. They are part of a systematic deep strike campaign. Ukraine does not necessarily need to destroy every refinery beyond repair. It does not need to erase every port from the map in a single night. It only needs to keep landing blows. Every fire matters. Every tank lost matters. Every day a site is offline matters. Because in infrastructure this large and this financially important, even short interruptions are painfully expensive. A few hours of lost operations can cost millions. Several days of shutdown can inflict real strategic damage. And when multiple sites are hit in the same month, the losses begin to stack into something much bigger than the sum of individual strikes. That is exactly what appears to be happening now. Russia is not just losing physical infrastructure. It is losing rhythm. It is losing efficiency. It is losing export flexibility. It is losing confidence in the safety of its own rear areas. And most importantly, it is losing money. For all Putin's rhetoric, for all the propaganda about endurance and patriotic sacrifice, the Russian war machine still runs on hard cash. It needs oil revenue to function. It needs those dollars and rubles to sustain production, logistics, salaries, repairs, subsidies, and repression. When Ukraine hits oil, it is not attacking an abstract industry. It is hitting the bloodstream of the state. That is why these attacks matter so much politically as well as militarily. Putin can absorb battlefield embarrassment for a time. He can bury casualties in propaganda. He can reframe losses as sacrifices for a greater national mission. But if the money starts drying up, the entire structure of his war begins to strain. Recruitment becomes harder. Equipment shortages become harder to conceal. Production bottlenecks grow. Economic anxiety spreads. Oligarchs worry. Regional governors worry. Ordinary Russians begin to feel the cracks more directly. And that is when even a heavily controlled regime starts to look fragile. This is the position Putin is moving toward. His army has failed to achieve most of its stated objectives. Russia remains internationally isolated. The economy has been battered by sanctions, war costs, and long-term structural damage. Many of the alliances Moscow once leaned on now look weaker, colder, or far more transactional. And now the one dependable source of strength the Kremlin thought it could always rely on, the oil sector, is being hammered into its weakest state in years. Ukraine has understood this clearly. President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly argued that crushing Russia's oil industry is one of the fastest and most effective ways to shorten the war. The evidence increasingly suggests he is right. If Ukraine can maintain this pace, or intensify it further with greater numbers of drones, improved range, or more missile support, then the pressure on Moscow will become even more severe. Every additional strike amplifies the last one. Every new disruption undermines Russia's ability to recover. Every refinery fire, every terminal shutdown, every tank farm explosion, every delayed tanker, and every damaged loading system eats away at the foundation of Putin's war. And that is what makes this campaign so dangerous for the Kremlin. It is not just destructive. It is cumulative. It is strategic. And it is aimed at the one sector Russia cannot afford to lose. Putin launched this war expecting Ukraine to collapse quickly. Instead, he created an enemy that has become more innovative, more disciplined, more dangerous, and more capable of fighting a long war than anyone in Moscow expected. Now that same enemy is taking aim at Russia's economic jugular with increasing precision. And unless something changes dramatically, this campaign will only keep pushing deeper. Russia's oil lifeline is no longer secure. It is under sustained attack. It is burning in Black Sea ports, smoking in Baltic terminals, and shutting down in refineries hundreds of miles from the battlefield. It is bleeding revenue, capacity, and credibility. And if this continues, Putin may soon find himself confronting the one thing he has tried hardest to avoid since 2022, a war he cannot fund, cannot win, and cannot survive politically.